Since just the other day I bounced up to over 500 subscribers, thank you so much. With your help, one day I may shoot this from somewhere other than my bedroom. So, who knows what the future may bring? This channel is about opening one's mind to the strangest, to the weirdest, and sometimes the most profound and inspired thoughts, but in a real way. These are my real life stories of the impossible. So like I was saying yesterday, my friend Webb Sentell, the Bigfoot expert, he goes out into the middle of the national forest in the middle of the night, cuts through a thick wall of branches, broken trees, and brush, finds himself in what would appear to be a Bigfoot campsite, but no Bigfoot are around, so he sits there and he meditates, blindfolded, in the middle of the night, without any weapons, and he waits, and within like 30 minutes or so, somehow he starts to feel the presence of Bigfoot, and sometimes they even touch his face. Crazy, right? I don't even know if that's, I mean, the funny thing about that story is it's impossible for me to think of myself even doing something like that. What Webb says to me is that at the very least, he did kind of get over his fear of being in the dark. So, but the fact is that he consciously felt them, actually being around him. So then eventually he would come to, and then he would play these little games with them. So this is where it gets kind of interesting, because he would leave them little treats. So sometimes he'd leave them jars of sweetbread, and what would happen is he'd go there the next night. He would literally do this like every single night, like for weeks on end. And so he would go out into the middle of the night and do this, and he would leave jars of sweetbread out at his little campsite that he found. And what would happen is the next day he would go and the jars of sweetbread would actually be open. So these are jars that have a screw-on lid, and somehow he would puncture holes in the top so that they could smell it through the actual lid. But they would actually be able to open the jars. So whatever it was that was getting into that sweetbread was opening the jars. And sometimes the jars would be reclosed, but they'd be reclosed in a kind of weird way, like they're not used to the screw-on lids. And sometimes they'd be reclosed extra tight, showing the, strength of such a large creature like Bigfoot. And then the other thing is that sometimes the jars would actually be, at least one time he mentioned that the jar was about 12 feet high in the crook of a branch, almost like the creature had taken it out of the jar, eaten the sweetbread, closed up the jar, and then stuck the jar in this branch. But because Bigfoot is a large creature, perhaps he could just plunk it down in the crook of a branch, but it's too high for even Webb to reach. So that's kind of crazy, huh? And then he plays these games, which call the marble games, and other strange games. He'd leave dolls and toys and things like that. Sometimes, once he left a doll, it like ended up plucking out one of its eyeballs. One time he left marbles in there, around there, and they had like placed the marbles, these 3 marbles, into like a configuration of a triangle. That's kind of interesting. So what is it that he's interacting? The way I see it is that either he is interacting with some kind of a spirit or creature that is perhaps not even human, or he is interacting with a human who's trying to mess with him. They're following him out there in the middle of the night and then messing around with his campsite in the middle of the night. Who knows? Or he's just making the whole thing up, and the whole thing is a big old lie. Because the weird thing about this story is that if it's true, it's a really, really weird truth, right? And so, but if somehow Webb Sentell is, and I don't think of him as being like a pathological liar, I really don't. I mean, I've met the guy, and the guy is pretty straight up, pretty much like Webb Sentell is a guy who I would think of as being an ordinary guy if he didn't have this crazy story. And so that is what I call a real life story of the impossible. If you ask me, you can actually you can't really ask me because I'm not the one who actually experienced any of this stuff. My friend John Alexander did experience in which one of these Sasquatches or whatever actually rushed the campsite screaming really loudly, and they even got a recording of it. So some crazy stuff happened out there in the middle of the forest, about 100 miles away from civilization, and yet that's the weird thing about it, is that you can't totally prove it. You just got to accept the possibility of something weird sometimes just happens, and you can't really wrap your head around it. So that concludes my story. My real life story of the impossible is about as impossible as it gets. My friend Webb Sentell, hope you comment below if you've ever experienced anything like this in the past. Please subscribe and to this channel if you haven't. Share it with a friend. Why not? And thank you so much for your subscriptions and your coming out and watching these little videos. We'll talk to you tomorrow, same time, same weirdness. Peace.